We're joined here today by Senator Warner, the chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee, to talk about the Murthy versus Missouri case, which will be argued before the Supreme Court shortly. Senator, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
You felt this case, Murthy versus Missouri, was important enough to file an amicus brief in support of the government. Can you tell us why you felt so strongly about this case?
And in a way, I was actually surprised that other public figures didn't weigh in more affirmatively. This case, which was generated by far-right attorney generals, is trying to stop the voluntary communications between the social media platforms and entities like the FBI or NSA or CISA. And in a realm where those kind of conversations in the past have always been voluntary, and particularly when it comes to the questions around foreign election interference, I think it is really, really troubling, the implications of this case, and God forbid if it were actually be upheld by the Supreme Court. I do think it's important that as we think about this, particularly since we've seen the right try to rewrite in many ways what happened back in 2016, this was not some benign effort of Russia to kind of simply float some memes or put forward some bots. It was a organized effort by the Russian spy services with their designated entities like Prigozhin's IRA operation out of St. Petersburg to meaningfully infiltrate our system, to pit Americans against Americans. It included, it was very, very powerful. And I would urge people as they think about this case and the implications to go back and read the classified bipartisan investigation that the Intelligence Committee did into Russian interference, to lay out how extensive it was, how dramatic it was, how some of the Russian efforts did things like had Twitter followings that were around, for example, Black Lives Matter. The Russians had a fake entity called the Blacklist Group that was larger than the Black Lives Matter. On the other end, it had something that was a fake Tennessee Republican Party group that had more followers than the traditional Tennessee Republican Party. The Russian efforts instigated real Americans, where there was one site in Texas that was kind of pro-Muslim. There was another site in Texas that was pro-Texas secessionists. They created a fake event where actual Americans showed up that would have engaged in violence, but for the Houston police. So this was not benign by any means. And it really caught both the American government and the social media companies off guard. And I know we'll get into some of the conversations. The voluntary communications that took place afterwards really helped protect us going forward. And those could all come to a halt under this case.
Senator, you make some excellent points there about how this underlying case from the Fifth Circuit prohibits social media companies from communicating with the FBI, with the NSA, with CSIA.
From your vantage point as the chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee, could you provide some insights into what the real world consequences of this case would be?
Well, the real world consequences, and we're in a certain sense seeing them play out right now, because after July 5th of last year, even though there was a stay put in place, there have been no communications. We've had testimony from all of those government agencies, and I've had informal conversations with the social media companies, so that the voluntary communications, where if we were to see a foreign malign actor trying to interfere in our elections, or if Facebook were to see evidence of that kind of activity, in the past, we would share that information. It made us better prepared in 2018, better prepared in 2020. The tech CEOs actually requested, I remember many times after the 2016 election, Mark Zuckerberg saying, Warner, if the federal government is seeing this kind of activity, tell us, let us know. The real world implications are, I unfortunately believe we are now in March of 24, months away from our next national election. And I feel we are less prepared today for the 24 elections than we were at the corresponding time in the 20 elections. Partially due to this case, partially due to the fact that there are a greater number of Americans who don't trust anything in our electoral system, partially due as well to the fact that countries like Russia, but also China, Iran, and others have a much higher interest in interfering in our elections. And then you have all those factors, again, also brought about by the case. And then you have this whole new scale of tools that can be brought to bear with AI.
Senator, you mentioned the real world consequences since the courts have started to make some decisions on the Murthy versus Missouri case. And some of that has been the withdrawal of government officials talking to social media companies, from social media companies talking to the government. Can you talk to us a little bit how that discussion, that informal arrangement of government and social media companies talking to each other evolved after the 2016 election? How did threat sharing and kind of come to be, and how has it really helped their defenses against foreign malign influence?
We saw the social media companies, I still vividly remember, and I've given Mark Zuckerberg appropriate grief on this a number of times, when I raised concerns as early as late November of 2016. And Zuckerberg famously said, if any politician thinks that there was any Russian or foreign interference on our platform, they must be crazy. Well, we weren't crazy. There was evidence. And Zuckerberg, to his credit, and others repeatedly said, hey, we want to clean this up. If it's happening, please share this information with us. That led to enhanced cooperation. It led, frankly, to then the U.S. government being very aggressive in 2018 in affirmatively taking down some of the Russian capabilities. And uniquely, it led in 2020, even under President Trump, with good folks that Trump had, like Chris Krebs at CISA and Paul Nakasone at NSA. Obviously, Director Wray was still in place at the FBI as well, where it helped protect our country because of this voluntary sharing. And the fact that that's not going on now, part of this due, I think, candidly, to the Biden administration their lawyers being way too cautious. I think we've brought some public pressure there, and literally in the last couple of weeks, I think they have given a little better guidance, and some of those communications are starting to take place. But it is hugely concerning. And on top of that, the other thing that's happened is that the social media companies' efforts, which they promoted a great deal, that, hey, we're going to look at this, we're going to have teams of people that will monitor and try to be aware, and not only in terms of election interference, but Facebook, acknowledging some of the misdeeds that were taking place in terms of treatment of the Rohingya by the Burmese leadership, and how they use Facebook as a frankly agent of hate spreading. They all increased their monitoring. Unfortunately, we've seen a company like Twitter that was fairly forward-leaning on some of these issues, obviously under Musk, completely retreat from the space. We've seen Facebook as well cut back on some of their efforts. I think the same with Google and YouTube. And then we've got new platforms like TikTok, where we just don't know, because we have no visibility into the algorithms and no visibility into how much the Chinese Communist Party may influence some of that content, making this for a kind of a brew that again, I think we all ought to be worried about.
The question that comes to mind then, is this case comes before the Supreme Court, is if we were in a pretty decent place and now this happens, how would you assess our ability to respond if this case, even if this case is dismissed, if it goes away? Are we now behind too much? Can we still catch up?
I think we can catch up, but I think one of the things that's taken place beyond the direct election interference, we have seen, the whole tenor of conversation of what is kind of within the bounds of traditional politics greatly expand. I think it's called, expanding the Overton window, where, type of oftentimes race-baited, race-baited, anti-Semitic, you know, kind of the things that were beyond the bounds. Now, the social media companies allowing more and more, oftentimes violating their own terms of service, and the kind of far right has bullied them into not even adhering to their own, terms of service, which by people participating on their platforms were supposed to be agreeing to abide by those terms of service, and the platforms are not enforcing those. So we are behind. I think my committee and others need to do a better job of kind of putting the public on notice, and we will be holding hearings in a public setting. I'm trying privately and publicly to force the Biden administration to raise the focus on this. I'd like to know who in the administration is in charge of election protection overall. I don't think I know that right now, or is going to be the point person, while there will be different agencies play different roles. So I think we can still get ahead of this. And what we may be, frankly, a little bit benefiting from is that some of these same nation states will be, I believe, interfering in other elections around the world this year. I think we've all heard about the fact that over half the world is going to have elections this year. Countries like Russia will be intervening in other elections. Maybe we can learn from some of those actions and be better prepared. And since it doesn't look like we're actually going to do major legislation around election protection this year, there was something that we were able to put together just recently at the Munich Security Conference, where 20 of the tech companies, including Twitter, or X, including TikTok, including Facebook, including all of the major players, have said that they will work at least on a voluntary basis in terms of AI in elections by doing watermarking on AI-altered content, on trying to work collaboratively to take that kind of content down, and to help educate the public writ large across all the nations where elections are taking place. Again, the proof will be in the pudding, but I thought that was at least a good sign.
Senator, thanks so much. What are the strategies that you believe are necessary for effective collaboration between government and social media companies in addressing these foreign malign influence actions? You had mentioned that there's a just mass of people who don't believe in anything anymore, which I believe is part of the foreign malign influence playbook. Mm-hmm. So how do we overcome these from both a public and private standpoint?
Well, still trying to figure out who those trusted sources will be is, I've not cracked the code on that yet. I think it's terribly important, and one of the things I'm proud of the Intelligence Committee, we still operate on a bipartisan basis. I think continuing to put bipartisan warnings out helps a little bit, because it feels like we're not favoring one side over the other. One of the tools that CISA has in the cybersecurity infrastructure security, I'm not even sure if I fully recall all what it all stands for, but CISA was set up to be this place where people could communicate on a voluntary basis, not just on cybersecurity, but on, this is where a lot of the activity took place to protect the machinery of our elections, the actual voting machines, our tabulating machines. And the good reason that CISA was created was because it doesn't have any enforcement or regulatory ability. People should feel comfortable using that as a tool. So I think that's important. And I do worry how we've seen some of the tools that were put in place, frankly, under the Trump administration by Chris Krebs on the actual election machinery. We've seen actual jurisdictions move away from using what's called the Einstein system that goes down to the precinct level in terms of protecting the integrity of the vote. There have been many of these, an entity called ERIC that had multi-state collaboration on protection of voter rolls. Some states opting out of that, even though it was all set up initially bipartisan and again under the Trump administration. So I hope we can do more to kind of not only look at foreign malign influence on misinformation, disinformation, but also make sure that we continue to shore up these parts of our system that protect the integrity of voting.
Part of the Murthy versus Missouri case is the claim that government is putting unfair pressure on private entities like social media companies. And in your brief, you mentioned that the industry executives and corporate representatives that you talked to have never really expressed that they felt compelled or coerced by that kind of engagement. And given that dynamics and potential concerns, do you think they're telling the truth? Like,
listen, these executives in these companies are not shrinking violets. I mean, they do not hesitate at all to tell me or anybody else in government when they think we're wrong, and they tell us that repeatedly. And remember, this collaboration and this kind of open, voluntary communication was asked for by these tech execs, because I think they realized their platforms were being misused. So I think this notion of coercion, I think, is just plain false. I have not heard any of those. As somebody who deals with these folks for the most part on a pretty regular basis, I've not heard any of them cite government coercion, particularly when it comes to this question about foreign malign influence.
I think that's an excellent point. Most of these companies have cap values higher than a lot of small countries' GDPs.
Right. And most of them think of themselves almost as independent countries.
So I think that's really important to note. And because they are quite powerful, as the 2024 elections approach, can you share your concerns about if any portion of the injunction in Murthy v. Missouri remains in effect? And I think CISA is really important, the Cybersecurity Infrastructure and Security Administration, not being able to communicate in real time, which they did a lot in the past several elections, highlighting false information that was going out to hinder voters in real time.
That real-time effort, I mean, recall that it was the Trump administration late in the 2020 election that brought most of the leadership of the FBI, CISA, and other key entities in a public briefing where there was Iranian influence around the Proud Boys group, and they were only able to go public in a timely fashion because you had this real-time communication. And think about how that real-time communication helped, and there was no unwillingness of the Trump administration officials to go public with saying, hey, if you see this, be careful, beware. And that was 2020. That was before we have all of the AI tools, which can bring this level of manipulation through deep fakes, both video and audio. We've already seen the voice deep fake of Biden in New Hampshire in terms of a robocall. We need an immediate response mechanism because with AI tools, this can happen at a speed and scale that frankly, I still am not sure we're fully prepared for. So the idea that if you're not going to have this voluntarily basis, you have this pause, it could be a disaster because the bad effects could take place. And again, this is not something that's that unusual. The government on a regular basis does defensive briefings all the time. I see this repeatedly from my role as intelligence chair, where we alert people to cyber incursions done by foreign actors. We alert folks to at times when they may be becoming unknowing victims of foreign intelligence activities. The notion that we couldn't do this or wouldn't be able to do this on a timely and again voluntary cooperation basis is just stunning to me. And again, goes back to your initial question of why I filed the amicus brief. This is a big, big deal. And people across the political spectrum who want our elections to maintain their independence ought to be concerned.
Well, and it feels like if any of this is the injunction is upheld in this case, it's not going to stop at social media companies, right? That's a template for potentially saying any engagement with the private sector could be off limits, and that really infrastructure, as you mentioned, banks, finance, just seems like that could be a line that's really problematic.
Right. I mean, could you imagine this same kind of reasoning being said? The bank shouldn't have voluntary cooperation if you see bad actions take place. I mean, the key, and again, why CISA is so important as a kind of the repository for some of this information flow. There are so many domains where the bad guys can use technology tools to try to interfere. We've got to be able to respond on a real-time basis. And a lot of this is about sharing that information so that if you see the bad guys take actions in one institution, one domain, whether it be banking, utility, or as we're focusing today on elections, you can then share that with other folks in that particular sector. That's just the way we operate in this system. And I think, again, the implications of this case, if taken to the extreme, could cut back on all that kind of communication.
I think one final question in the realm of this brief, you mentioned, and you talked a little bit earlier about AI, the emergence of generative AI as a new frontier, not just in this case, but, as you think about that threat of generative AI in elections or as your role as Senate Intelligence Chair, can you just talk a little bit for the public about the concerns you have about generative AI and the kind of potential threats from it?
Well, again, AI can, AI tools, and we're starting to see these already as they roll out, can have you see something or hear something. And if seeing and hearing is supposed to be the old way, the way we validate stuff, seeing and hearing is no longer the validation tool, because the AI tools will get so good so quickly that if there's not that watermarking that indicates to a consumer, no, this is altered content, you could have real chaos. And where I've got legislation on this around elections. I'm not all that optimistic it's going to get done before the election. One of the reasons why at least the voluntary agreement that we all, the tech companies signed up for in Munich, would at least be some framework. But what I always had thought with AI was the two areas where AI tools right now can already cause great disruption. Elections, we talked about. The other one could be manipulation of our public markets. And I'm frankly surprised we've not seen more of that. With not only a deep fake of a CEO saying something he didn't or she didn't say, but also in terms of product manipulation. There are so many ways I've thought about how AI tools could mess with a public stock's valuation. And I thought, well, maybe there might be this grand alliance between the big C capitalists and the small d Democrats, because the same kind of tools could manipulate in both domains. And I thought that might be an alliance I could put together. I've not been that successful yet on that. I do have bipartisan legislation in the financial sector that would charge FSOC with this and also put potentially treble damages for stock price manipulation using AI tools. But that kind of grand concern between advocates in both spaces hasn't come to pass yet. I always thought, boy, that would have been a perfect place to kind of educate the public, but so far not been so successful.
Would love to transition a little bit into courts more generally. This is one of several cases coming up from the Fifth Circuit, which has shown no compunction in just taking giant gouges out of the government's ability to protect Americans from malign foreign influence, financial fraudsters, and even undermine medication approvals.
This is the Fifth Circuit is one that went after the abortion pill. It's gone into some of the kind of most egregious restrictions on abortions, even when a woman's life was in danger. It's Yes. yes.
So it's been my theory that the extremity of the Fifth Circuit has allowed the Supreme Court to walk some of them back, yet still be increasingly aggressive in conservative judicial opinions that curtail the government's ability to protect Americans in so many of these issue areas. So I'm just wondering what the Senate can do to reassert its primacy as the first branch of government and enacting the will of the American people that the court seems so willing to thwart.
Yeah, great question. That would take a slightly more functioning Senate and House of Representatives than maybe we have at this moment. I think, and this is not in regard to the Fifth Circuit, but I think the, frankly, absurd ruling coming out of the Alabama Supreme Court about folks who use IVF techniques to help couples who've not been able to have children to have children was kind of so far beyond the pale that you see Republican candidates, including President Trump, all racing to say, oh, trust me, we don't want to get rid of IVF. But that's the implication of that Alabama court. When the courts get so far out of the mainstream, of course, even on the IVF case recently, the Democrats in the Senate put forward, I think, a relatively straightforward bill that says, okay, well, let's enshrine this in federal law. And of course, when push came to shove, the so-called pro-family and pro-life party wasn't willing to actually stand up and be pro-family or pro-life. They objected to the Duckworth bill. So I think this is a challenge when the courts go so far outside the mainstream, or what have we been viewed traditionally the mainstream over the last 50 years from both sides. When the political debate goes so far out of the mainstream, when you then have nation states, and I keep coming back to Russia, which partially they obviously have favored candidates, but they also just want to try to sow dissent in conflict into our country. That all those activities combined with an American public that is already suspicious of anything in authority, that is a cauldron of pretty potent forces that I hope the Congress will step up. But it's one of the reasons why you got to step up as much as possible in a bipartisan fashion.
One last question. Now, the Supreme Court has taken a lot of controversial cases this term. Hopefully, they will walk back the Fifth Circuit in some of these instances. But they've also made a lot of radical decisions over the course of the last few years, as you've noted. So how do you feel the court has changed over the course of even the last decade? And how has that impacted the trust the Senate and the American people have in the court?
Well, the court, and the Supreme Court in particular, at the end of the day, as a non-elected body, you has to rely on trust that it's going to play down the middle, that it's going to be fair and impartial. And taking what had been settled, at least kind of jurisprudence around the right to choose, and overthrowing that with the Dobbs decision, I think went a bit to the heart of that trust. On top of that, the fact that the court has failed to put in place a set of ethics requirements for its own members. I'm strongly supportive of Senator Whitehouse's bill that would try to say, in effect, the Supreme Court ought to have the same set of ethics that the rest of us all adhere to. Some of the reports, at least, about Judge Thomas's level of gifts and favors received. I think the court needs to be self-aware enough that each of these actions all become cumulative when you add them all together, and it undermines the trust that people have in the court. There have been conservative courts, there have been liberal courts. I mean, you could argue in many ways we've had a conservative court almost since President Reagan, but it still had legitimacy. But when it goes beyond, when it throws out Roe v. Wade with the Dobbs decision, when it has members of the court appearing to take gifts that don't pass the smell test. When you've got a justice like in Justice Thomas, who at least appears is unwilling to recuse himself on some of the cases involving President Trump's efforts to overthrow the 2020 elections, when it appears again fairly obvious that his wife was actively engaged in those activities. The cumulative effect of all that, I think, really undermines the court's legitimacy in many ways. And I think that is bad news, because when that trust is lost, it can't be replaced overnight, even if the court suddenly became less conservative and became more moderate. It just, once you lose this kind of faith, it is a currency that cannot be quickly restored.
Thank you, Senator. We appreciate your time.
That was awesome.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.